It had been over a decade since the family had last visited the farm. To most of the children, the old farmhouse was little more than a distant memory. Snippets of summer days spent in the fields, the scent of freshly baked pies wafting through the kitchen, and the sound of laughter echoing in the yard. To the parents, however, the farm represented something more, a place to reconnect with simpler times, where life was slower, and the worries of the world could be left at the door. For a family like theirs, the farm was a sanctuary, a retreat from the pressures of modern life. So, when the opportunity arose for them to spend their upcoming vacation there, it seemed like the perfect escape. The long drive from the city to the rural countryside was uneventful, with the endless stretch of highway giving way to winding dirt roads and fields of corn swaying in the breeze. The older children chatted in the back seat, reminiscing about their childhood trips to the farm, while the younger ones were more concerned with the abundance of space and the prospect of exploring. As they neared the property, the landscape began to feel more familiar, like a place from a half-forgotten dream. The family home, though older and more weathered than they remembered, stood proudly at the edge of the property, flanked by a grove of tall trees. When they arrived, it was late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun bathed the farmhouse in a warm glow. The air felt crisp, and the scent of earth and pine trees filled their lungs. The moment they stepped out of the car, a wave of nostalgia washed over them. The house seemed to welcome them, its windows reflecting the sky above, the porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. It was, for all intents and purposes, a picture-perfect country getaway, until the silence settled in. The farm, though beautiful, had an eerie stillness that no one could quite explain. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves in the trees. It was as though the world had momentarily stopped, holding its breath in anticipation. This silence, while not immediately alarming, felt unnatural. The children, oblivious to the discomfort that had started to settle in their parents' minds, ran eagerly toward the house, excited to explore their childhood stomping grounds once more. The parents, however, lingered on the porch, exchanging uneasy glances. It wasn't just the quiet that unsettled them. It was the feeling that something was different. The farm hadn't changed much, but they couldn't shake the sense that the place wasn't quite the same as it had been when they left it years ago. The air, thick with the scent of soil and decay, had a heaviness to it. It was a feeling they couldn't name, but one that seemed to press against their chest. After a few moments, they shrugged it off as simply being out of practice, as though returning to a place once loved could only stir up the dormant remnants of old memories. The house itself had been untouched for years. The creaking floorboards, the faded wallpaper, and the slightly warped wooden beams gave the space an air of neglect. Yet, there was something oddly comforting about the familiar sight of the living room, with its old furniture draped in sheets. The dining table, where they'd shared countless meals, was still in place, though the chairs had gathered dust. As the family wandered from room to room, they began to settle into the rhythms of farm life, unpacking their belongings and organizing their days. Outside, the sprawling fields lay under the dying light of the sun. The crops were well maintained, but the barn, a structure that had once been full of life and livestock, stood empty, its doors ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. It was a curious thing to see it so abandoned. The family had always relied on the farm for its produce and animals, but the barn now seemed hollow, its purpose forgotten. The silence continued to hover around them like a cloud, but they pressed on, determined to enjoy their time away from the bustle of daily life. That night, after dinner, the family gathered in the living room. The children told stories of their adventures. The parents exchanged small talk, and the quiet hum of contentment filled the room. Yet, when the clock struck midnight, something changed. It wasn't the sudden flickering of the lights, nor the wind that had begun to pick up outside. It was a feeling, a presence, that seemed to have materialized in the space between them. The air grew heavy again, and for the briefest moment, the house felt colder, as if the warmth of the day had been sucked away. The family glanced at each other, uneasy, but said nothing. It was only a draft, they reasoned, As they turned in for the night, the parents shared a lingering glance before heading to their bedroom. The door creaked shut behind them, and the house fell silent once more. But just as they settled into bed, a soft noise, a faint tapping, sounded from the hallway. It was rhythmic, like the footsteps of someone walking just outside their door. The parents exchanged worried looks, but neither of them moved. They assumed it was nothing more than the old house settling. Still, the sound persisted for several minutes before finally fading into the stillness of the night. The farm had welcomed them back, but something about it felt wrong. There was an inexplicable weight in the air, as though the land itself held memories long buried, memories that would soon awaken, whether they were ready or not. The first night was only the beginning, and the family had yet to realize that the farm they once loved held far more than just memories. It held secrets that would soon unravel, revealing a darkness that had been dormant for far too long. The morning after their first unsettling night at the farm arrived with a crisp, clear sky and a soft, cool breeze that whispered through the trees. For most of the family, it was a welcome sight, a new day, full of possibilities after the oddness of the previous evening. The children were the first to wake, their excitement evident as they rushed to the kitchen, eager to begin their day of exploration. The parents, however, lingered in their bed, exchanging weary glances. Despite the reassuring brightness of the morning, there was still an undercurrent of unease that lingered in the air. The house, though bathed in sunlight, felt heavier than it had before. The family went about their morning routines, though a quiet tension filled the air. Even the youngest, usually full of boundless energy, seemed unusually subdued. They ate their breakfast quickly, with little conversation, and then split off into smaller groups, each family member gravitating toward their own interests. The children, determined to get their hands dirty and explore the land, set off toward the back fields to look for old tree houses or hidden paths that may have escaped their memories. Their parents, meanwhile, stayed closer to the house, tidying up and preparing for the day ahead. As they ventured further from the farmhouse, the children quickly lost track of time. They hadn't realized how long it had been since they last roamed the fields, their feet crunching on the dry earth beneath them. The landscape seemed familiar, yet distant. The familiar landmarks, stone walls, overgrown pathways, and the occasional forgotten garden, now felt eerie, as if the fields had long ago stopped belonging to anyone. There was an unnatural stillness to everything. The trees, which should have swayed in the wind, stood rigid and silent. The birds that had once filled the air with song were nowhere to be heard. Even the breeze, which had been present at the start of the morning, had died down to an unnatural calm. The silence, at first a comforting break from the noise of their city lives, began to feel oppressive. They tried to shrug off the sensation, attributing it to their own overactive imaginations, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of their minds. The farther they walked into the fields, the stronger the sensation became. It was as if the land itself was watching them, waiting. The taller grasses rippled at their feet, but there was no wind to explain the movement. The children paused, staring into the distance, as a soft murmur seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, they dismissed the sound as the wind, but the more they listened, the more it became clear that the murmurs were something else entirely. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the sighing of wind. It was a whisper, a voice that seemed to call out just beyond their reach. It was faint, unintelligible, but there, it grew louder with every step they took, drawing them deeper into the heart of the fields. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, and an uneasy chill washed over them. One of the children, the eldest daughter, decided to investigate. She ventured farther into the field, her curiosity outweighing the sense of discomfort creeping up on her. The whisper seemed to be coming from a patch of tall grass near an old wooden fence. As she neared the spot, the whispers grew louder, though they still made no sense. They were not words, but rather an indistinct murmur, a sound that carried with it a sense of urgency, of something trying to be communicated from the other side of the world. She stopped, frozen, unsure whether to proceed. The others, sensing her hesitation, gathered around her, but they too heard it now. The faint murmur in the wind, the voices that seemed to tug at the edges of their consciousness. Unable to resist, they pressed on, drawn toward the strange, unexplainable sound. The field before them appeared untouched by time, tall grasses swaying in unnatural patterns, the ground beneath them cool and soft, as if something ancient lay just below the surface. They stopped when they reached the old fence, its weathered wood leaning at strange angles, as though it had been abandoned for years. The whispers seemed to be coming from the other side, beyond the fence, though there was nothing visible there. Only the long, uninterrupted stretch of land leading to the horizon. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, as though they had been abruptly cut off. A heavy silence settled over the children, and they turned to one another, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. What had just happened? It was as though the very essence of the land itself had shifted in that moment. The suddenness of the silence was deafening. They turned to leave, but as they did, they noticed something strange. An old, rusted key lying in the tall grass near the fence's base. The key seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong in this field at all. It was covered in dirt, its edges worn with age. Yet, despite its decay, it felt inexplicably important. The children gathered around the key, but before they could examine it further, they were startled by a loud, rustling sound coming from the distance. They turned to look, but the field remained still, as if mocking their fears. With the key in hand, they made their way back to the farmhouse, the strange murmurs still lingering in the back of their minds. They hadn't noticed it then, but when they glanced back at the field one last time, they could have sworn they saw a shadow moving in the distance. Too far to make out, but unmistakably there. When they returned to the house, their parents were busy inside, preparing for lunch. The children tried to explain what had happened in the fields, but the words caught in their throats. They sounded ridiculous even to themselves. Who would believe that they had heard voices in the wind, seen shadows where there were none? Their parents, for their part, listened patiently, but there was a quiet skepticism in their eyes. The farm had always been a quiet place, and surely that was all there was to it, a product of the vast, empty land around them. But deep inside, both the children and their parents could not ignore the unsettling feeling that hung over the farm, one that only seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The day continued uneventfully, but the whispers in the fields had planted a seed of unease that none of them could shake. It had been so real, so tangible, yet it was impossible to explain. It was the first of many strange things that would soon come to light. Things that would challenge their understanding of the farm, their family, and what it truly meant to return to a place long thought forgotten. The days passed quietly, though the sense of unease on the farm only deepened. The children, still unable to shake the feeling of being watched, tried to engage in the usual activities that a vacation on a family farm promised: exploring, playing, and enjoying the open air. But nothing felt quite the same. The land, though beautiful, seemed to pulse with a strange energy that none of them could fully explain. The once familiar landscape now felt foreign, as if something had changed beneath its surface, something imperceptible but undeniable. It was as if the farm had a memory of its own, a memory that stretched beyond the years the family had spent there. The house, too, seemed to echo with the weight of time. Each room, once filled with the warmth of familial gatherings and holiday meals, now felt oddly sterile, as though it had been abandoned for years. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of dust and neglect. Yet, despite the obvious signs of age, everything appeared to be in its place. The furniture, the paintings on the walls, the family portraits, all remained as they had been, unchanged by time. But there was something unsettling about it. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, the family gathered in the living room to enjoy a quiet evening. The children had grown restless, their conversations laced with talk of the strange occurrences in the fields. But their parents, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, brushed off their concerns, attributing the unease to the unfamiliarity of the surroundings. "You're just letting your imaginations run wild," the father said, chuckling. "This is a peaceful place. It's just the quiet that's getting to you." But even as he spoke, he couldn't deny the strange, nagging sensation that had taken root in his own mind. He, too, had felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the land or the whispers the children had heard. It was the sense that the farm, in its isolation, had preserved something long forgotten. But what? And why now? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would bring the past crashing back into their present. The following morning, the family decided to visit the nearby town, hoping that a break from the farm would help ease the tension. They wandered through the small, quiet streets, trying to distract themselves from the growing sense of dread that had begun to take hold of their hearts. But even in the town, they could not escape the feeling that something was wrong. The people they encountered seemed distant, their eyes heavy with an unspoken knowledge. When the family asked about the farm, the responses were always vague, filled with unease. "It's a good place, I suppose," one man had said, his voice trailing off as he glanced over his shoulder, as if afraid to speak too openly. "Used to be full of life, but things change, don't they?" Back at the farm, the children, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere, wandered into the attic, a place they had often explored during previous vacations. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. Old toys, books, and photographs. As they rifled through the boxes, one of the children found something strange, a weathered journal, its pages yellowed with age. The journal was unlike anything they had ever seen before, its leather cover cracked and worn. It seemed ancient, its presence unsettling in its familiarity. The child opened the journal, and as they began to read aloud, the words on the pages sent a shiver down their spine. The journal had belonged to a woman named Eleanor, someone the family had never heard of. The entries were written in a flowing, elegant script describing life on the farm in the late 1800s. But the words grew increasingly unsettling as they continued. Eleanor spoke of strange noises at night, of whispers in the fields, and of shadows that moved on their own. Her final entry was the most chilling of all. "They are here. I can hear them. I fear I may never escape." The journal seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as though the words written within its pages were not simply memories of the past, but warnings of something yet to come. The children, terrified, closed the journal and hurried back downstairs, eager to share what they had found. When they told their parents, the reactions were mixed. The father, skeptical as ever, dismissed it as nothing more than a relic of the past, a curiosity meant to stir up old fears. But the mother, reading the entries over the child's shoulder, could not shake the feeling that the events described mirrored their own experiences on the farm. That night, after the children had gone to bed, the parents sat in the living room, the journal lying open on the table between them. They discussed what they had read, their voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might wake something they were not ready to confront. The whispers in the fields, the eerie silence that seemed to settle over the farm at night. It all began to make sense in a way they weren't prepared for. Eleanor's words were not simply a reflection of the past. It was as though the journal was a key to understanding the strange occurrences that seemed to have followed the family back to this farm, a key to unlocking the mystery that lay buried beneath the soil. But even as they tried to make sense of the journal, the feeling that they were being watched grew stronger. The air in the house felt heavier, more oppressive. The silence of the night was shattered by strange sounds coming from outside, the sound of footsteps crunching through the dry grass, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. The father, determined to get to the bottom of it, grabbed a flashlight and went outside. But when he reached the fields, there was nothing there. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and grasses, but the eerie stillness had returned. Yet, deep in his gut, he knew something was wrong. The land, the house, the journal, it was all connected in ways he could not yet understand. The following morning, the unease that had clouded their minds lingered, heavy and unrelenting. The family sat around the breakfast table, the journal now resting in the center, its presence like a weight in the room. They knew they could no longer ignore what was happening. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain buried. Something had been awakened on the farm, something old, something powerful. And it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known in full. The whispers were just the beginning. As the days wore on, the family could no longer ignore the creeping sense of unease that had taken root in their lives. The past seemed to haunt them in ways they hadn't anticipated, manifesting not just in the journal, but in the very atmosphere of the farm. What had once been a place of simple joy and peaceful respite was now something else entirely. The land felt alive, pulsing with an energy that was both unfamiliar and unnerving. The silence, which had always been a part of the farm's charm, had grown thick and oppressive, as though something unseen was waiting just beyond the edge of perception. The children, once eager to explore the fields and woods surrounding the farm, had begun to retreat into the house, no longer venturing far from the safety of its walls. They spoke in hushed tones to each other, their words filled with fear and curiosity, but also with a growing sense of disbelief. It was as if the world they had known had shifted, leaving them stranded in an unfamiliar place where the rules had changed and no one knew how to navigate them. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of fleeting glimpses of figures standing at the edge of the woods, of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The parents, while still trying to rationalize the events, could feel the tension rising in the air. They knew something was happening, something beyond their control, but they struggled to find a way to explain it. The mother, especially, felt a growing connection to the land, as if the farm itself had some hold over her, drawing her deeper into its mystery. It was a feeling that she could not shake, and though she had always dismissed such things as superstition in the past, she found herself more and more attuned to the subtle changes that seemed to occur around her. The rustling of the leaves, the shifting of the wind, the creaking of the house, all of it felt deliberate, as though the farm itself was trying to communicate. The father, on the other hand, remained skeptical. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences, to prove that there was a logical explanation for everything. He had spent the last few days combing through the journals, the letters, and the old records of the farm's history, searching for any clue that could explain the unsettling atmosphere. But the more he searched, the more he felt as though he was circling around something he could not quite grasp. The farm's history was dotted with strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and vague references to things best left undisturbed. The deeper he dug, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slip through his fingers. It was during one of his late-night readings that he came across a particularly strange entry in the journal. Eleanor had written about a recurring event that took place every few years, something that she referred to as the Gathering. The entry was vague, filled with cryptic references to figures in the shadows and rituals performed in secret. Eleanor had described the event as something that filled the air with a palpable sense of dread, as though the very fabric of reality was being stretched and torn. She had been terrified, but the entries seemed to indicate that she, too, had felt the farm's pull, unable to escape its grip despite her growing fears. The last line of the entry read, "They come when the harvest is complete, and when they do, you cannot hide." The father had read those words over and over, unable to make sense of them. Who were they? And what had Eleanor meant by the Gathering? He felt a chill run down his spine, a sense that he was on the verge of uncovering something that might be better left unknown. His rational mind wanted to dismiss it, but the unease that had settled in his chest told him that there was more to this than coincidence. The strange events at the farm, the journal's cryptic messages, it was all connected, and whatever the Gathering was, it was something they would soon have to face. Meanwhile, the children continued to experience unsettling encounters. One night, after a long day of silence, the youngest child, Emily, had wandered outside. The sky was dark, the stars obscured by a thick layer of clouds, and the wind had picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill through the air. She had walked to the edge of the field, drawn there by a strange compulsion she couldn't explain. As she stood there, looking out into the distance, she saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the farthest corner of the property. It was too dark to make out any features, but the figure was unmistakable. Emily froze, her heart racing. The figure didn't move, but it felt as if it were watching her, waiting. Terrified, She turned and ran back to the house, her footsteps pounding on the dirt path. When she burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed, she tried to tell her parents what she had seen, but they dismissed it as a figment of her imagination. Yet, deep down, they could not ignore the unease that had settled over the household. Something was out there, something they could not see, but could certainly feel. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow the land whole, and the oppressive silence had become a constant companion. Later that evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift once again. The air grew thick, heavy with an energy that none of them could explain. They could hear something, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above them. The father, determined to confront whatever was causing these disturbances, grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs. But when he reached the top of the stairs, there was nothing there, no sign of anyone, no evidence of movement. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. The family could no longer ignore the truth. Something was very wrong on the farm. The land, the house, the journal, they were all tied together, and the past was demanding to be acknowledged. The father, now convinced that the farm held some dark secret, knew that they couldn't leave. Not yet. They needed to understand what had happened here, and why it was happening again. But as he looked out over the fields, he felt a deep, gnawing fear. He wasn't sure they would survive the answers they sought. The shadows had begun to shift, and with each passing day, they grew closer. As the family continued to navigate the strange happenings around the farm, the sense of dread only deepened. There was a subtle but undeniable change in the environment, a kind of foreboding that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Each morning, as the sun rose over the fields, it cast an eerie glow across the land, too warm, too orange, as if the day itself were reluctant to begin. The wind would pick up unexpectedly, moving in sudden gusts, whispering through the trees with a quiet intensity. The birds had stopped singing, and the air felt unnaturally still. It was as though the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. The children, no longer playing in the fields, spent their time huddled together, either inside the house or by the windows, peering out into the distance with wide, anxious eyes. They had come to understand that something was wrong, but they lacked the language to describe it fully. It wasn't just the strange shadows or the feeling of being watched. It was the way the land seemed to pulse with an energy that unsettled them to the core. They could feel it in their bones, in the pit of their stomachs, and in the quickening of their hearts whenever they stepped outside. But despite their fear, there was also a sense of inevitability. Something was coming. The parents, meanwhile, were no longer able to deny the increasing unease that had taken hold of their home. Every day seemed to bring new signs, whispers at the edges of their hearing, objects shifting or disappearing without explanation, and the occasional strange figure glimpsed through the trees or standing in the fields just beyond the house. These fleeting glimpses were enough to unsettle anyone, but they remained just that, brief, indecipherable moments, too elusive to confirm or explain. The father had begun to spend hours poring over the journal, seeking any connection he could find to these occurrences. He had discovered another chilling passage, one that gave him pause. When the moon is dark and the harvest is gathered, they come. The gathering has begun. The phrase had stuck with him. The gathering. He couldn't shake it from his mind. It was as if the words themselves held power, as if they knew what was coming long before he did. He began to piece together a disturbing picture from the journal's cryptic references. But the more he read, the more confused and fearful he became. Eleanor had written about the ones who walk in the dark, and their arrival at the farm at the end of each cycle. What those words meant, he could not say, but they rang in his mind like a warning bell, each page adding weight to the mystery. There was something ancient about it, something tied to the land, something that could not be ignored. The night of the new moon arrived, and with it, the oppressive sense of anticipation that had been building in the air. The sky was a thick black canvas, devoid of stars, and the silence outside the house had become almost unbearable. The wind had died completely, leaving an unsettling stillness that hung over the land. Inside, the family gathered in the living room, trying to make sense of the growing tension. No one spoke much. The children clung to their parents, and even the dog had gone silent, its ears flattened against its head. It was as if all the creatures of the land had retreated, as if they were waiting for something. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, it began, a distant sound, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a low hum, almost like chanting, drifting in from the fields. The father stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up, an instinctual sense that something terrible was happening. The hum was not just a sound. It was a presence, a pull, an undeniable force drawing closer with each passing second. He turned to his wife, but her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if she, too, knew that the moment had arrived. The children had begun to tremble. They clung to their parents, unable to tear their eyes from the windows as the humming sound grew louder and more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from the farthest reaches of the farm, from the edge of the forest where the land seemed to fade into shadow. The hum was joined by a strange, rhythmic thumping, as if something large was moving in the distance, shuffling through the underbrush. The father grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door, but as he opened it, he was met with a cold rush of air that took his breath away. It was as though the very atmosphere had changed, thickened, as though something was pushing back against him, forcing him to stay inside. But the father wasn't about to turn back now. His instinct told him that they were facing something far beyond the ordinary, and that whatever it was now too late to turn away from. He stepped out into the night, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The thumping had stopped, and the hum had quieted, replaced by a new sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too many to count. They seemed to move toward him, from every direction, as if the very land itself was coming alive. He could feel his heart race as the shadows shifted around him, twisting and stretching, reaching out for him. It was then that he saw them. Figures, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the field. They were impossibly still, their shapes barely discernible in the darkness. But as his flashlight swung across the field, they moved, slowly at first, then faster, their long limbs stretching unnaturally, their bodies contorting in ways that defied reason. They were coming toward the house. The father's breath caught in his throat as the figures drew closer, their faces shrouded in darkness, their eyes glowing with an eerie light that reflected nothing of the world around them. They moved with purpose, and as they crossed the threshold of the farm, the air seemed to thicken even further, pressing down on his chest. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, to buckle, as if the earth itself was pushing back against him. The world had tilted, and as he stumbled, he realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The gathering had begun, and it was only a matter of time before the farm, and everything connected to it, would be claimed by whatever dark force had arrived. Back inside the house, the family could do nothing but watch in horror as the shadows moved closer, inch by inch, toward the walls of their home. The mother gathered her children close, whispering words of comfort, but her voice trembled, and she could not hide the fear in her eyes. They had heard the stories, the warnings, but now they were living it. They were part of it. And as the figures began to surround the house, the father's desperate cries for help were swallowed by the night. The gathering had begun. The night after the gathering had begun was unlike any the family had ever experienced. The oppressive darkness seemed to stretch on forever, pressing against the windows, seeping through the cracks in the walls, and choking out any sense of normalcy that might have remained. The once comforting creak of the old farmhouse settled into an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional shuffling of feet in the hallway or the soft murmur of anxious voices. The father, still outside, had not returned, and the family was left to wonder if the figures they had seen moving toward the house had claimed him or simply driven him away. Fear and confusion hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Inside, the children had clung to their mother, whispering frightened questions that she couldn't answer. They could not fathom what had happened to their father. Had he been taken by the strange figures in the fields? Or had he run off in panic, abandoning them to face the unknown? The mother's mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm, to provide some semblance of reassurance to the children. "Your father will return," she said, though the words felt hollow even as they left her mouth. She didn't believe it herself, but what else could she say? The terror that had gripped her heart was something she had no words for. But as the hours stretched on and the moonless night deepened, the fear began to transform into something else, a dull, gnawing sense of dread that crept into their bones. It wasn't just the figures that haunted the edges of their perception, or the strange sounds that filled the silence. It was the land itself. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a prison, its walls no longer a shelter, but a barrier between them and the horrors lurking outside. The earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though it too was alive and waiting. The mother tried to keep the children occupied, though their minds were clearly elsewhere. They were quieter now, more withdrawn, as if the weight of what they had witnessed had drained them of their energy. The youngest girl, who had once been the most spirited of them all, now sat motionless by the window, her wide eyes fixed on the darkness outside. She had not spoken a word since the figures had appeared, and the mother could only wonder what terrible thing had been imprinted upon her fragile mind. The older boy, too, had taken to staring out the window, though his gaze seemed far more focused. He was looking for something, or perhaps someone, his father, perhaps, or the shadowy figures that had moved so unsettlingly across the fields. The morning, when it finally came, brought no relief. The sun rose, but it did so weakly, as though unsure of its own power. It cast an ashen light over the land, the fields appearing dull and lifeless under its feeble glow. The mother tried to force herself to look at the day with hope, but she could not shake the feeling that the sunlight was no longer enough to keep the darkness at bay. The house felt colder now, and even the smell of fresh earth, which had once been comforting, now felt heavy and oppressive. It was as if the land itself had become a stranger, hostile and unwelcoming. The father, of course, was still missing. The mother had tried to go outside to search for him, but the moment she stepped beyond the door, she felt the pull of the land. It was as though it were calling to her, urging her to stay inside. She could not explain it, but it was a feeling that had overtaken her body, locking her in place. The fields seemed to stretch out before her like an endless expanse of shadows, and the trees stood still, as if frozen in time. She had tried to call for him, but her voice was swallowed by the vastness of the land, disappearing into the air as if it had never been spoken. As the days passed, the family became more isolated. The surrounding town was too far for them to reach on foot, and the old farmhouse was too remote for anyone to easily come to their aid. The phone lines had been dead for as long as they could remember, and there were no neighbors nearby to turn to for help. It was as though they had been cut off from the world. The hum that had echoed through the night still lingered in the air, faint but constant, like a distant drone that would never fade. It seemed to resonate with the earth itself, as though it were connected to something far older and more powerful than they could understand. The mother found herself drawn to the journal again, desperate for answers. She had read it cover to cover the night before, but now she returned to it with a new sense of urgency. She flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain the events that had unfolded. There were more references to the gathering, but they were vague, cryptic. Eleanor had written about the harvest, about the land, and the ritual that had been performed on the farm long before they had arrived. It was unclear whether Eleanor had been speaking of something that had happened in the past or something that was yet to come. It was as if she had known all along that this moment was coming, but the meaning of her words remained just out of reach. It was in the final pages of the journal that she found a new entry, one that had not been there when she had first read it. The ink was fresh, as though it had been written recently, and the words were haunting in their simplicity. When the moon is dark and the earth is still, the harvest will return. The gathering will come again. The mother's blood ran cold as she read the words. She could not explain why, but she knew that the harvest spoken of in the journal was not a simple crop. It was something else, something far more sinister, and the gathering, whatever it was, had returned. The day passed with little change, but as night fell, something shifted. The wind, which had been still for so long, began to stir, rustling the trees and carrying with it a strange, unrecognizable scent. The air grew thick, and the once familiar sounds of the farm seemed to warp and distort, like a recording being played backward. The shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, creeping across the ground as if they were alive. The family huddled together in the living room, knowing that whatever had begun was far from over. Outside, the land seemed to stir in anticipation. The hum, faint at first, began to rise once more, vibrating through the air like a living pulse. The family could hear it now, clearer, louder, and they knew that the next stage of the gathering was about to begin. They had no way of knowing what would happen, but the mother felt it deep in her gut. They were no longer in control. The land had claimed them, and there was no escaping it. The silence that had followed the storm was no longer a relief. It was a prelude to something darker, something that had been set into motion long before they had arrived. The gathering was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The house felt as though it had changed overnight. What had once been a familiar, if slightly eerie, home had become a place that was both foreign and suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange, resonating hum that no one could explain. Each corner, once filled with the warmth of family memories, now felt like it harbored something dark and ancient. It was as though the house itself had awakened to the presence of the family, and in doing so, had become an active participant in the haunting that had begun to unfold. The mother, still reeling from the journal's final entry, had tried to dismiss her growing paranoia. After all, there was no rational explanation for what had happened. The sudden disappearance of her husband, the strange figures in the fields, the noises that had filled the house, all of it was too out of the ordinary to explain away easily. But the more she tried to brush it off, the more her mind would return to the same question. What was the gathering, and why did it seem to be tied to the land they had chosen to vacation on? She couldn't shake the sense that this place, this farm, had some long-forgotten connection to events and rituals far older than the family's presence. The entries in Eleanor's journal were cryptic, but they hinted at something that had taken place here long before their arrival. Something hidden beneath the soil, beneath the floors of the house itself. The mention of the harvest stood out to her, and she couldn't help but feel that it had a double meaning. It was not simply a crop that was harvested here. It was something darker, something that had been nurtured for years, perhaps centuries. Unable to dismiss the feeling that there was more to the land's history, the mother decided to take a walk that afternoon. She knew she had to find something, anything, that could explain the strange occurrences that had escalated since the night of the gathering. The children were still huddled inside, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her husband was still missing, and the house, with its unsettling noises and oppressive atmosphere, had become unbearable. As she ventured out into the field, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of something blooming, though she couldn't identify what it was. The air was thick and humid, but there was no storm to explain it. The silence, too, was unnerving. It was as though the world had muted itself in the presence of something unseen. Even the birds, which had once filled the air with their calls, seemed to have vanished. The stillness was suffocating. The path she followed led her toward the edge of the woods, the place where she had first seen the figures the night before. Her heart raced as she drew closer, her feet heavy with uncertainty. She was not sure what she was hoping to find. A sign that everything was normal, perhaps? Or maybe some trace of her husband. But she found nothing. No evidence of anyone or anything out of place. Only the trees, standing like sentinels in the quiet, darkening light. It was then that she noticed the ground beneath her feet. The soil was darker than she remembered, rich and damp, as though it had been recently disturbed. The trees seemed to grow closer together here, their branches twisting together in an unnatural way, blocking out much of the fading light. The air smelled different here, too musty, like something old and decaying. And beneath it all, there was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a hum that was too low to hear clearly, but felt deep in her bones. It was the same sound that had filled the house the night before. Curiosity led her deeper into the woods, despite the growing sense of dread that settled in her stomach. She pushed through the underbrush, making her way to a small clearing. And there, she found it, a circle of stones, ancient and weathered, half hidden by the overgrowth. The stones were arranged in a pattern she could not immediately recognize, but the placement seemed deliberate, intentional. She ran her fingers over the rough surfaces, feeling the cold stone beneath her fingertips. Her pulse quickened as she realized that this was not just a forgotten relic of nature. This was part of something much older, a place where rituals had likely been performed long before her family had come to stay on the farm. It was impossible to ignore the connection. The journal had mentioned the harvest, the land, and the rituals. This circle of stones was a part of that. The realization struck her like a wave. The land, the house, even the family's arrival here had not been accidental. The gathering, which at first appeared to be a bizarre and terrifying event, was not something that had started with her husband's disappearance. It was something that had been in motion long before they arrived. The land had been waiting for them. It had been calling them in ways they hadn't understood. As the mother stood in the center of the stone circle, she felt a sudden shift in the air. The wind picked up again, more forcefully this time, swirling around her in a violent gust. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as though the earth itself were alive. She stumbled backward, fear rushing through her veins. She had to leave. She couldn't be here any longer. But as she turned to retreat, she heard something, a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was her husband's voice calling her name. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen, unsure if what she had heard was real or just her mind playing tricks on her. She couldn't afford to be mistaken. Her husband had to be somewhere nearby. But where? She had to find him. But the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and she felt that it would not be easy to leave this place. The hum in the air grew louder, as though it were vibrating through her entire body. And then, before she could react, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell to her knees, the earth beneath her crumbling as though it had been disturbed for the first time in centuries. She looked around in horror, realizing that she had awakened something ancient, something powerful, by stepping into this sacred space. The voice calling her name became louder, more urgent, but now it was no longer just her husband's voice. It was the voice of the land itself, calling out to her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. With her heart pounding in her chest, the mother tried to stand, but the earth had already begun to close in around her. She realized in that instant that the land had not been calling her to find answers. It had been calling her to become part of the harvest, to feed the ancient forces that had slumbered beneath its surface for so long. The gathering was not just a ritual. It was the continuation of a cycle that would not be broken. And now, they were all part of it. The family, trapped in the house with their growing fears, had no way of knowing that the mother had already crossed into the heart of the land's darkness. But in the woods, where the hum reached its crescendo, the first harvest of the new cycle had already begun. The day after the mother's disappearance, the atmosphere at the farm grew heavier. The children, though frightened and confused, tried to hold onto a sense of normalcy. The youngest, Lily, had clung to her older brother, Lucas, all night, whispering that their mother would return soon, just as she always did after a long walk. But Lucas knew better. He felt a chill that settled deep into his bones, one that could not be ignored. He had seen the changes in the house, the growing darkness that seemed to take shape around them. His mother's absence now felt permanent, as if she had been swallowed whole by the land itself, lost to forces beyond their understanding. The house, too, seemed to react to her absence. The creaking and groaning that had once been a background hum had turned into something more purposeful. It was as though the walls were alive, aware of the shift in the air, the missing piece in their family puzzle. Lucas could feel the house breathing in tandem with the earth outside, as though it too were drawing in the power that the land had been calling upon. The eerie hum was constant now, and its source could not be pinpointed. It was everywhere, vibrating beneath the floorboards, in the ceiling, in the corners of the house, seeping into their skin like a toxin. Still, it wasn't just the house that had changed. The very land around them had begun to warp. The fields that had once appeared so wide and open now seemed to stretch farther than they should, as though the horizon had been manipulated by some unseen hand. The trees, tall and foreboding, had grown closer together, casting long, sharp shadows over the land that would never fully retreat into daylight. The farm no longer felt like a place of refuge, but a holding pen, an inescapable cage. The children could feel it, the pull of something deeper than the land, something ancient. As night fell, the unnatural silence that had overtaken the farm was broken. A knock on the door echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate. Lucas froze, his heart thumping in his chest. There had been no visitors since their arrival, and the thought of anyone arriving now, in this strange, suffocating place, filled him with dread. He moved cautiously toward the door, glancing at his sister, whose wide eyes mirrored his own fear. He opened the door slowly, expecting to see nothing but the thick, inky darkness of the night. But standing there, on the threshold, were two figures, tall, their faces obscured by the hoods of their long, tattered cloaks. They had the air of strangers who had wandered far from their own world, now standing before him as though they had always been there. The smell of the earth seemed to follow them, a deep, rich, fertile scent that seemed to seep from the very soil of the land. "Are you the children of the house?" one of them asked in a voice that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting, as though it belonged to the wind itself. Lucas nodded slowly, too frightened to speak, and the figure smiled, a motion that did little to ease the unease settling in his chest. "We've come for the harvest," the figure said, the words sending a shiver down his spine. "The harvest?" Lucas asked, though he knew that something terrible was being implied. He remembered the journal entries, the cryptic mention of the harvest, the land, and the gathering. But there was no time to contemplate the meaning. The figure's presence, and that of its companion, was enough to send a chill through the air, more biting than the night itself. Without waiting for a response, the visitors stepped into the house, their eyes scanning the interior with a chilling familiarity. The house seemed to welcome them, the doors opening wider, the shadows growing deeper. It was as if the house knew them, as if their arrival had been expected, prepared for long ago. The children, too terrified to move or speak, simply watched as the figures moved deeper into the house, their footsteps eerily silent. The first figure turned to face Lucas and Lily, its hooded face still obscured by shadows. "You should not be here," it said softly, though not in an accusatory way. "You must understand the land's needs, and the price that must be paid." Lily, her voice trembling, finally found the courage to speak. "What do you mean? What price?" The second figure raised its hand, signaling the first to be quiet. "The land has waited too long," it said, its voice like the sound of rocks scraping together. "Now it calls to you, and you will answer in time." Before either of the children could respond, the figures began to move through the house, their presence turning the atmosphere even colder. The walls seemed to react to them, shifting, groaning, as though welcoming them into the very bones of the home. Lucas felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. They weren't here for a simple visit. They had come for something that the house and the land had been preparing for. As the figures moved to the back of the house, toward the kitchen, Lucas followed them at a distance. His mind raced with questions. What did they want? Why had they come now? The answer, he suspected, lay in the mysterious happenings of the past few days, in the journal his mother had left behind, and in the presence of something that had taken root in the very land around them. But just as he was about to ask them again, one of the figures turned back toward him. "You will understand soon enough," it said, its eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. "The harvest is coming, and you must be ready. There is no turning back." And with that, they turned their attention to the shadows that danced in the corners of the kitchen. Lucas, frozen in place, could feel the air growing heavier, the pressure of the land's pull becoming more intense. He had no idea what was coming, only that the presence of these visitors marked the beginning of something far darker than he had ever imagined. something that had been waiting for them and for their family since the very moment they set foot on the farm. The visitors weren't here by accident. They were part of the land's ancient design, and whatever was to come would be beyond anything Lucas and Lily could have ever imagined. As the visitors settled into the kitchen, the air around them seemed to warp, thickening with an almost tangible pressure. Lucas and Lily, still rooted in place by a blend of terror and disbelief, watched as the figures examined the walls, the floors, and the beams above. Their eyes were unnerving, shifting constantly, glinting with an ancient knowledge that seemed far beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just that the visitors felt out of place. They belonged here. The house, as though under some unspoken command, seemed to shrink away from them, the wood creaking and groaning in protest at their presence. The first figure, the one who had spoken to them earlier, turned slowly toward Lucas and Lily. Its movements were deliberate, as though each step had been practiced for centuries. "This land," it said, its voice echoing in the stillness, "is not as it seems. It has been waiting, calling to those with the bloodline to return." There was a pause, as if it wanted the weight of those words to sink in. Your mother understood, but she chose to ignore the call. Now, you must face what she failed to. Lily, her eyes wide with terror, barely managed to find her voice. "What do you mean? What bloodline? What do you want from us?" The figure's gaze softened, though not in a comforting way. It was the sort of softening that comes when one looks at something that is almost a part of them, but is still very much separate. "The land remembers," it replied simply, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "It always has, and it waits for the return of those who are meant to tend to it. Your mother was supposed to be the one, but now it is your turn." Lucas felt a sickening knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known something about this place wasn't right, but hearing it spoken aloud made the horrifying reality of their situation hit him with full force. His mother, the woman who had seemed so connected to the farm, to the land, had somehow failed to fulfill her role. And now, it seemed, it was his and Lily's turn to pick up the pieces. But he didn't understand. What was the land asking for? And why did it seem to have such power over them? The second figure, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. Its voice was like the dry scraping of stones, each word grating against the ears. "The land needs to be fed. It needs sustenance, and it cannot wait any longer. The harvest is nigh." "What harvest?" Lucas demanded, his voice breaking through the thick air like a crack of thunder. "What are you talking about? What do you want from us?" The visitors exchanged a look, and for the first time since their arrival, they appeared almost human, uncertain, perhaps even unsettled. The first figure reached out, laying a cold, bony hand on Lucas's shoulder. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock of ice through him. "The land feeds, but it demands payment in return. Your mother understood this, but she thought she could escape it. She thought she could leave." There was a deep, sorrowful sigh that seemed to resonate from the figure itself. "But nothing leaves. Not here." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, casting a long, dark shadow over Lucas. Leave? His mother had never mentioned anything about leaving. She had always spoken fondly of the farm, of the way it grounded her, of how it gave her peace. But now, it seemed there was something darker buried beneath her love for the land. Something she had tried to escape, or perhaps had tried to hide from her children. Lily, still clutching her brother's hand, whispered, "Are you saying that, Mom?" "Yes," the figure answered, cutting her off. "Your mother tried to escape what she was meant to do, what this land needed from her. But there are forces beyond her, beyond all of us, that demand the balance be kept. That is why the harvest is here, and why it will not wait for you to be ready. The land has already claimed its price." The words were like ice water on Lucas's skin, and he could feel his heart racing, thudding in his chest with a violent, terrifying rhythm. What did it mean? Claimed its price. What had his mother done? And what would be the cost of their ignorance? A sharp, almost imperceptible sound echoed from the farthest corner of the house, a scraping, like the sound of branches brushing against the roof. Lucas turned to look, but saw nothing. The silence in the house deepened, and the temperature dropped even further, so much so that he could see his breath misting in front of him. The very air had become heavier, suffocating. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath. The second figure turned its head slightly toward the sound, and there was a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "It begins," it murmured, and for the first time since their arrival, both figures seemed to prepare themselves for something. Lucas couldn't tell what, but he felt it, the change. The land had already begun to stir, its ancient wool coursing through the house like a tide that would not be stopped. The first figure stepped forward again, eyes locking onto Lucas. "You will understand soon enough," it said. "The price must be paid, and you must choose. Either you become the harvest, or you take what has already been given." It paused, its gaze growing even colder. "And once you make your choice, there is no turning back." Lucas couldn't breathe. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of everything that was happening, of the strange, chilling visitors, and of the land that seemed to hold them in its grasp. He had come here looking for a simple holiday, but now it seemed as though he had stepped into a world of old, forgotten rituals, of promises made long before his birth. The figures didn't wait for him to respond. They turned and began to walk toward the back door of the house. As they did, the very air seemed to shift with their movement, as if the land was reacting to their presence. Lucas and Lily stood frozen, watching, unable to speak, as the visitors disappeared into the night. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of earth, of decay, of something far older than either of them could have imagined. The harvest was coming, and it was not going to wait. The night seemed to stretch endlessly after the visitors had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a sense of dread that clung to the very walls of the house. Lucas and Lily sat in stunned silence, unable to move, their minds racing with 1,000 questions. What had just happened? What were the visitors? What had they meant by the land's price and the harvest? It all felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, but the chilling air and the sound of creaking wood beneath their feet told them otherwise. Despite the fear that gripped them, they both knew they couldn't stay inside forever. The house was no longer a sanctuary, but a prison, a space that seemed to grow colder with every passing minute. After what felt like hours, Lucas stood, his body moving as if controlled by something beyond his own will. Lily followed suit, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty and terror. They knew, deep down, that they had to uncover the truth, whatever it was. If they didn't, the land would claim them, just as it had claimed their mother. Outside, the air had grown thick with fog, and the once familiar farm now looked unrecognizable. The faint outlines of the barn and the old apple tree were barely visible through the mist. The wind howled in the distance, its mournful sound like a warning. Every instinct told them to turn back, to forget everything they had seen and heard, but they couldn't. The visitors' words echoed in their minds, and they knew that there was no escaping the pull of the land. Something was happening here, something that could not be ignored. As they made their way toward the barn, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the land was alive, that it was watching them. The earth beneath his feet seemed to hum with energy, as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. He glanced over at Lily, her face pale, her steps hesitant. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine, but he didn't believe it himself. There was something dark at work here, something ancient and unstoppable. The barn loomed ahead, its wooden structure warped by years of decay. The door creaked open as they approached, and they hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and hay, but there was something else too, something foul, something that made their stomachs churn. As they ventured further into the barn, they noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that they didn't recognize. They looked old, ancient even, and they seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. "Do you see this?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed to one of the symbols. It was a circle, surrounded by intricate lines and shapes that seemed to move if she looked at them for too long. "What is this? What does it mean?" Lucas could only stare at it, the same feeling of unease crawling up his spine. He had no answers, only questions. But he knew, deep down, that these symbols were not here by chance. They were part of something much larger, something that had been waiting for them. The visitors had spoken of a harvest, of the land demanding a price. Was this the ritual they had referred to? Were these symbols a map of some kind, a guide to the land's ancient rituals? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence, sharp and deliberate. Lucas's heart leapt into his throat as he spun around, only to find no one there. But the feeling of being watched intensified, as though unseen eyes were tracking their every movement. Lily reached out, grabbing his arm, her grip tight with fear. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Lucas nodded, though he didn't know if she was referring to the visitors or to something far more sinister. The barn was silent again, but the air felt charged, as though something was building, waiting to erupt. They turned their attention back to the symbols, hoping that they might offer some kind of clue. But as Lucas studied them, he felt a shift. Something was changing. The symbols began to glow faintly, their lines lighting up like veins under skin. It was as if the barn itself was coming alive, reacting to their presence. Lily gasped. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing to the far corner of the barn. There in the shadows, something moved. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew larger, as if coming toward them. Lucas felt his breath catch in his chest. The movement was unnatural, too fluid, too deliberate. It was almost as if it were a part of the barn itself, crawling toward them with purpose. "Get out of here," Lucas hissed, grabbing Lily by the arm and pulling her toward the door. But the barn seemed to fight them, its entrance suddenly feeling impossibly far away. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with each step they took. And then, as if sensing their panic, the thing in the corner lunged. It was a shape, not fully formed, but unmistakably alive. It was a grotesque, shifting mass, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. It moved with a mind of its own, its form flickering between shadow and substance. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed a dull, unnatural red, and they locked onto Lucas and Lily with an intensity that made their skin crawl. They screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the barn, as if the very structure of the place was devouring their voices. The thing reached out, its tendrils extending like grasping fingers, but just as it was about to make contact, the barn door flew open with a violent force. The sudden gust of wind slammed into them, pushing them out of the barn and into the foggy night. They stumbled back, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with the shock of what they had just witnessed. The barn stood silent behind them, its door now hanging open like a gaping mouth waiting for them to return. "What was that?" Lily gasped, clutching Lucas's arm as though he were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "I don't know," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. "But I think we're just getting started." The harvest had begun, and there was no turning back. The chilling winds carried with them a sense of finality as Lucas and Lily stumbled away from the barn, their bodies shaking, their minds racing. The fog that surrounded them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a heavy, suffocating presence that clung to their skin and wrapped itself around their lungs. Every step they took away from the barn felt like a battle against an unseen force, as if the land itself were reluctant to let them leave. The shadows in the distance grew longer, more twisted, and they both knew instinctively that something was unfolding that they could no longer ignore. Lucas could feel his heart thudding in his chest as they reached the house. It had always been a place of comfort, something familiar amidst the unknown. But now, as they stepped through the front door, it felt foreign, alien, as though it no longer belonged to them. The air inside was thick with the same unease that had followed them from the barn. The walls seemed to close in on them, pressing down with a weight they couldn't escape. They were trapped, inside the house, inside the land, inside a story that was no longer theirs to control. "We have to leave," Lily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to get out of here before it's too late." Lucas shook his head, his mind refusing to accept the growing terror. "We can't," he replied, though his voice cracked. "We're bound to this place now. Whatever this is, it's part of us. It's part of the land." His words felt hollow, as though they had already been decided by some greater force beyond his understanding. There was no escaping the land. Not now. Not after everything they had seen. Lily looked at him, her face pale with dread. "What do you mean? What do you think is happening here?" she asked, her voice desperate for answers, for any shred of logic to cling to. But Lucas didn't have any answers. He could only feel the deep, gnawing certainty that they were too late, that something had already begun, and there was no stopping it now. The house creaked and groaned around them, as though it were waking up, stretching its bones after a long slumber. In the kitchen, the old wooden floorboards shifted unnaturally, a soft sound like the cracking of dry twigs underfoot. They both froze, the silence becoming unbearable. It was no longer just the land they had to fear. Something inside the house had changed as well. Something that was no longer human. Lily grabbed Lucas's arm, her grip tight and unyielding. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen. The air seemed to crackle with an energy that sent chills down their spines. The shadows, once mere silhouettes, now seemed to move with purpose, stretching and shifting as if they had a mind of their own. Lucas took a hesitant step forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the growing tension. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and he could see the faintest outline of movement through the crack. It wasn't just the shadows, it was something more. Something was there. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, but before he could touch it, a sound broke the silence, a whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. "Come closer," the voice called, its tone soft, almost coaxing, like the lull of a distant memory. "Come closer and see what you've awoken." Lucas's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He'd heard it before, many years ago, when their mother had spoken of the land's secrets, of the things that were hidden beneath its surface. But he had dismissed it as superstition, as nonsense meant to frighten children. Now, those words felt too real, too close, and he realized with a sickening certainty that their mother had known more than she had ever told them. "Well, what is that?" Lily asked, her voice barely more than a breath. She was gripping Lucas's arm, so tightly now that it hurt. "I don't know," he whispered, the fear rising within him like a tidal wave. "But we need to go. Now." But before they could move, the door to the kitchen swung open on its own. The air inside seemed to ripple, as though a great force was pushing against it. The shadows inside the room stretched toward them, reaching like fingers, pulling them in. There was no escaping it. Not now. They had come too far. They had awakened something. With a rush of movement that was almost too fast to follow, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form shrouded in the same shifting shadows. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It stood there, motionless, staring at them with an intensity that felt like it was burning through their souls. "Welcome back," the voice echoed, though its source remained hidden. It wasn't a voice, at least not one that belonged to a human being. It was something older, something darker. And Lucas knew then, with chilling clarity, that it had been waiting for them. Waiting for the day when they would come back to the farm, to the land that had claimed their ancestors long ago. "What do you want from us?" Lily cried, her voice breaking with desperation. "Why are you doing this?" The figure in the doorway didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was already written in the land, in the harvest that was already beginning to take shape beneath their feet. It was a harvest of shadows, of things that had been buried deep within the soil, things that had been waiting for the right moment to rise. And that moment had come. The figure took a step forward, and with it, the shadows moved. They swept across the floor, swirling like smoke, enveloping the room in darkness. Lucas and Lily were no longer sure if they were standing in the house, or if they had crossed over into something else entirely, something ancient, something beyond the realm of the living. The whispering voice returned, this time not from the shadows, but from everywhere. "You have returned to the land, and now the land claims its price. The harvest begins, and you are the seed." And in that moment, As the shadows closed in around them, Lucas realized that there was no escape. They were part of something much larger now, a part of the land, a part of its twisted, eternal harvest. And the price would be paid, whether they were ready or not. The night seemed to stretch endlessly around Lucas and Lily as they stood frozen in the center of the farmhouse, surrounded by the oppressive darkness that had overtaken every corner of the house. The figure, tall and impossibly thin, had not moved. Yet its presence was palpable, like a pressure in the air, thick and suffocating. The shadows that wrapped around it seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, as though they were alive in a way that had nothing to do with the natural world. As the voice echoed through the room, Lucas felt the weight of its words. The harvest begins, and you are the seed. He could not understand what it meant, not fully, but the very idea struck him with a profound sense of dread. The land had always held an air of mystery, something his family had never spoken of in clear terms. But now, it seemed like the land itself had a consciousness, an awareness of its own that was darker, older, and more powerful than anything he could have imagined. Lily's breathing was shallow, each gasp a reminder that they were not alone in this nightmare. She tugged at his arm, as if trying to pull him back from whatever this was, but Lucas could feel the growing pull of the land on them both. The shadows were no longer content to merely cling to the walls or dance across the floor. They were seeping into their very skin, filling their lungs, closing in on them in a way that made it feel as though they were drowning in the darkness. "We have to get out," Lily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But her words were hollow now, like a prayer whispered into the void. Lucas turned his gaze back to the figure in the doorway, a figure that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows themselves, as though it was not separate from them, but an extension of them. A creature born from the very fabric of the darkness that had haunted the land for centuries. "There's no escaping," Lucas said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The certainty in his tone startled him. It was as if the very land had already claimed them, and no matter how far they ran, it would always find them. The truth settled within him like an iron weight. The land had always known this day would come. The land had been waiting for them. The figure shifted then, its movements slow but deliberate. There was no need for hasty action. It had all the time in the world. It stepped forward, its face still obscured by the shadows, but Lucas could feel its eyes on him. They were not human eyes, not by any stretch of the imagination. They were something ancient, something that had seen countless generations rise and fall. They were the eyes of something that existed outside of time, outside of human comprehension. "You think you understand," the voice continued, now coming from all directions, from the very walls themselves. "But you know nothing of what you've awakened. The land remembers. The land is alive, and it has always been waiting for you." Lucas felt a chill crawl up his spine as the words sank in. The land was alive. The realization was both terrifying and incomprehensible. For as long as he could remember, the farm had been a place of comfort, a place where his family had come to escape the outside world, to reconnect with nature and their heritage. But now, in the darkness, he understood the truth. The farm was never a sanctuary. It was a prison, and they were the prisoners. Lily's voice cut through his thoughts, a frantic edge creeping into it. "What do you want from us?" Her eyes were wide with terror, her hands trembling as they clung to his arm. "Why us? Why now?" The figure's shape seemed to blur, its outline becoming indistinct as the shadows swallowed it whole. And then, with a suddenness that left no room for reaction, it spoke again, its voice as cold as the grave. "You are not the first to walk these grounds, and you will not be the last. The land requires its payment, and you, like all those before you, will give it freely." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with meaning that Lucas could not fully grasp. It felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, a chasm that he was being drawn into against his will. He could hear the distant hum of something in the earth beneath him, a low and rhythmic thrum that seemed to echo from deep within the land itself. It was as though the very ground were alive, its pulse beating in time with his own. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath them groaned, and the farmhouse seemed to shift as though it were settling into something deeper, something darker. The walls creaked, and the shadows stretched further, wrapping around them like a blanket of darkness. The very air seemed to grow colder, and the faintest whisper of a distant song filled the room. It was a haunting melody, like something from another time, another place. Lucas's legs gave way beneath him as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He was not just trapped in the farmhouse. He was trapped in the land itself. The harvest had begun. The land was waking up, and it had always known that this day would come. He had been born into it, had lived his life on it, and now it was time for the land to claim its due. The figure in the doorway finally stepped forward, and for the first time, Lucas could see its face, though it was not a face at all. It was a shifting mass of shadows and whispers, a form that seemed to defy definition. But in its depths, Lucas saw something, a glimmer of recognition. It was a face he knew, a face that had haunted his dreams for as long as he could remember. The revelation hit Lucas like a thunderclap. The figure before him, a twisted amalgamation of shadow and distorted reality, had shown him the truth in a way he could not deny. The face that had materialized from the depths of darkness, so eerily familiar, was his own. He staggered back, eyes wide, heart pounding in his chest. The room around him seemed to warp, shifting as though the very laws of nature were being rewritten. But the most terrifying part was the realization that this abomination, had been waiting for him all along. It had not simply arrived. It had always been here, in the very marrow of the land. Lily, too, seemed to feel the weight of the moment. Her face, pale and drawn, flickered between disbelief and terror. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hand was still gripping his arm, though her hold was weakening, as though the terror surrounding them was siphoning her strength away. Lucas could feel her growing detachment, her own breaking down in the face of the impossible. But there was no time for her to break free of her fear. The figure, or whatever it was already speaking again, its voice slithering into every corner of the room. "Do you understand now?" the voice asked, though it came not from the figure itself, but from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the house. The land never forgets. The land never forgives. It remembers the blood that has been spilled, the promises that have been broken. And you, Lucas, you are not an exception. You are the fulfillment of a long-standing debt. Lucas felt as if the floor beneath him were crumbling, as though the house itself were dissolving into nothing. But despite the fear that threatened to paralyze him, a part of him clung to clarity. What did it mean? What was this debt? He could feel Lily's fingers trembling against his skin, her presence grounding him even as his mind raced to comprehend the implications. The more he thought about it, the more the sense of inevitability gnawed at him. This place, this farmhouse, this land, it had always been a part of something much darker, much older, and it had been waiting for the right moment to collect its due. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to elongate, stretching toward them like fingers reaching out from the void. The air turned cold, an unnatural chill that cut through their clothes and settled deep into their bones. Lucas shuddered, but refused to let the cold take him fully. Instead, he stood firm, trying to gather the fragments of understanding that floated in his mind. He looked at Lily, whose face had contorted in terror, and he knew that they needed to do something, anything, before the land claimed them too. But as he turned to speak to her, something shifted in the air, a subtle pressure that made him feel as though the world itself was closing in on him. It was as though a dark hand was pressing against his chest, squeezing the very breath from his lungs. He gasped for air, his mind racing. The land was alive, that much was clear now. But why? Why had it waited for him? The figure, or the presence that had been haunting them, stepped forward, its distorted body now seeming more solid, more real. It was no longer a mere shadow, but something substantial, something that seemed to draw the very light from the room. Lucas's heart thudded in his chest as the presence grew nearer, its unnatural form now towering over them both. He had no choice but to face it now. He had no choice but to confront whatever terrible truth it carried. "You cannot run," it said, its voice colder than the grave, its words laced with malice. "The land will not let you leave. It has been bound to you, to your bloodline, for generations. Your ancestors knew this, and they fed the land. But their time has ended. It is your time now." Lily finally found her voice, though it trembled with fear. What do you want from us?" Her words were frantic, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes, a refusal to simply accept the horror that surrounded them. The presence paused, as though considering the question. For a moment, the shadows seemed to settle, to gather in on themselves, until the form of the figure seemed to shrink, becoming almost human in shape. It spoke again, but now its voice held an almost mournful tone, as though it were speaking from some distant, forgotten place. "Nothing is truly wanted," it said, the words thick with sorrow. "But there is a price. The land must have its harvest, and it will take what it needs to sustain itself. The bloodline, your bloodline, has always been its sustenance. It will feed, it will grow, and it will remain alive as long as it needs to." The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Lucas's mind reeled. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Lily. This was bigger. The land, the curse, it had been going on for generations. The truth settled into his gut like a stone. They were not the first to face this, and they would not be the last. The land had always taken what it needed, and the cycle would continue, a never-ending loop. "How do we stop it?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper, yet it felt like the most desperate question in the world. She had to know. They both had to know. There had to be something they could do to escape this nightmare. But the figure only shook its head, a motion that seemed to disturb the very air around it. "There is no stopping it. You cannot break the cycle. You can only delay it. You can only make your peace with the land before it claims you. For the land will always claim what is its own." With that, the figure stepped back into the shadows, its presence receding like a tide pulling away from the shore. But the room did not feel any less oppressive. The darkness still clung to the walls, thickening with each passing second. And as the presence faded, a sense of finality washed over Lucas. The land had claimed them, and they had no idea what that truly meant. But they would soon find out. As the figure disappeared into the shadows, the air in the farmhouse felt still, like the calm before a storm. The oppressive silence that followed weighed heavily on Lucas and Lily. It was as if the very house itself had exhaled, the dark presence retreating only to leave behind the lingering remnants of its power. But in that stillness, something else emerged. The house, once a sanctuary for their family, now felt like a prison, a place where time had stopped, but the land's hunger continued to grow. The revelation they had just encountered wasn't something they could easily shake off. The land, the very soil beneath their feet, had been feeding on their bloodline for generations. And Lucas could no longer deny it. He was the latest offering. His blood, his existence, had always been intertwined with the farm, with its dark history. It was a truth too horrifying to accept, yet too undeniable to ignore. No matter how much he wished to escape, the land had already claimed him. Lily's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was silent. She had always been the one to keep a level head, the one who offered comfort and reassurance when things got tough. But now, she was frozen in place, struggling to process what had just been revealed. They were both caught in a trap they didn't understand. The farmhouse was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, one that required something from them, and the price was their very lives. In the days that followed, they tried to go on as though nothing had changed. They continued with the mundane rituals of daily life, eating, sleeping, attempting to keep up the facade of normalcy. But each moment was tainted by the knowledge of what was looming over them. It wasn't just the farmhouse that was affected. The land itself seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a quiet hum beneath their feet that they couldn't escape. The wind carried whispers through the trees, and at night, the stars seemed to flicker unnaturally, as if the universe itself had become unbalanced. One evening, Lucas found himself outside, standing at the edge of the field that stretched beyond the farmhouse. The horizon was clouded, an unsettling twilight hanging in the air. The land before him was vast, unyielding, and yet there was something in it that felt wrong, a subtle pull that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had never felt it so strongly before. The land was awake, it was aware of him, and it was waiting. Waiting for what? He could not say, but he felt the gnawing sensation deep in his gut. He turned back toward the house, as though he could outrun the feeling. But as he walked, his eyes caught something in the corner of his vision, a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was too distant to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was human, or at least it looked human. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. The presence from earlier? No, this was different. This was something more tangible. The land was changing. "Lily," he called out, his voice a tight whisper. He didn't know why he was afraid. He didn't know why his legs felt rooted to the ground. But he had to find her. Together, they had to confront whatever this was. He turned and ran toward the farmhouse, his mind racing. Inside, Lily was waiting for him. She had heard his voice, but she didn't need to ask what had happened. She knew, as he did, that they couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. The figure in the distance wasn't just a hallucination. It was a signal. It was the land, calling them to face the truth. They couldn't ignore it, not any longer. The cycle was ready to begin again, and they were at the center of it. They needed to leave, but deep down, they both understood that there was nowhere to go. The land had already marked them. It would follow them wherever they went. The harvest was never over. It never ended. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the subtle whispers of the wind outside, carrying with it the scent of the earth. The dark presence was always there now, hovering in the periphery of his mind. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. It wasn't just the house. It was the land. It was everything around them, waiting for the right moment to take what had been promised. At dawn, he ventured outside once more, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. The figure from the night before was gone, but the unease remained. The land was hungry, and he was its next meal. That was the only certainty now. There was no escape. There was no running away. The land would always claim its own. Lucas reached the center of the field, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He had to face it. He had to confront the reality of what had been set in motion. His blood, his lineage, had been part of this land for far too long. It was all coming full circle now, and there was no way out. He could only wait. Wait for the land to come for him. And when it did, he would have to pay the price. The harvest was coming. It would always come. In the days following their confrontation with the terrifying truth of the farm, Lucas and Lily were trapped in a limbo of fear and disbelief. Each day seemed to stretch on endlessly, a blur of monotonous activities and paralyzing dread. The land, the farmhouse, and the very air around them felt charged with an oppressive energy, as though they were not merely living in a place, but were being consumed by it. And despite all their attempts to distract themselves or make sense of the unfolding nightmare, the reality that the farm had claimed them remained an undeniable force that permeated every corner of their existence. Lily, ever the skeptic, tried to convince herself that it was all just their minds playing tricks on them. But even her rational mind could not escape the mounting sense of inevitability. The nights had become unbearable, each one filled with strange sounds and visions that made it impossible to find any peace. The walls seemed to breathe with the wind, and the floor creaked as if something or someone was moving within the house, even when it was empty. But it wasn't just the house that unsettled them, it was the land itself. The fields beyond the farmhouse no longer seemed like the quiet, pastoral landscape they once were. Now, they loomed over them, as if the soil itself could feel their every move, watch their every breath. It was during one of these restless nights, when sleep eluded them both, that Lucas found himself drawn outside. The air was thick with a strange energy, a sensation that tingled on his skin as if something was alive in the darkness. He walked cautiously toward the field, feeling the ground beneath his feet shift in a way that unsettled him. The land was changing again, becoming more than just earth and grass. It was as if it were a living organism, a creature with an insatiable hunger. His eyes were drawn to the spot where he had seen the figure in the distant days before. He hadn't told Lily about it, unwilling to add more fuel to the fire of their mounting fears. But tonight, something compelled him to approach. As he walked, the wind seemed to grow louder, the rustling of the grass becoming a steady hum, like whispers just out of reach. The closer he got to the spot, the more the air felt thick and heavy, as though it had been charged with static, waiting to discharge. Lucas knelt at the edge of the field, running his fingers through the earth. It felt different now, damp and cold, with an almost viscous texture. He hesitated, a sense of foreboding tightening in his chest. But then he dug deeper, pulling at the soil, trying to understand what had been so unsettling about this place. His fingers brushed something solid, something unnatural. His heart raced as he pulled at it, and soon enough, he uncovered the outline of a buried object. A box, rusted and covered in layers of dirt. It seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. His breath caught in his throat. What could it be? What had been buried here? The ground had been disturbed, and he realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't a random occurrence. It was deliberate. This was part of the land's secret, something hidden beneath the surface for who knows how long. He dug deeper, every instinct screaming at him to stop, but a force greater than his fear drove him to uncover the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas unearthed the box. His hands trembled as he brushed away the remaining dirt and lifted it free. The metal was cold and sharp against his fingertips, and for a moment, he simply stared at it, uncertain of what to do next. His mind raced. Was this the source of the land's power? Or had it been part of something far more sinister? The sensation of something watching him intensified, and Lucas could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He opened the box slowly, his breath shallow. Inside, there was nothing but a single object, a small, cracked mirror. He hesitated, not understanding what it meant. But when his eyes met the reflection in the glass, a chill ran down his spine. The face staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the figure he had seen before, standing in the distance, watching him from the shadows. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping the box. The image in the mirror was fleeting, vanishing as soon as he looked away, but its presence was undeniable. With his heart hammering in his chest, Lucas rushed back to the farmhouse, the box clutched tightly in his hands. He needed to show Lily. He needed to make sense of what he had found, but deep down, he feared what the answer might be. The land had a hold on them, and whatever power it had was rooted in the earth, buried beneath the surface for so long that it had become part of the very fabric of their lives. Lily was awake when he returned, waiting for him in the darkened living room. She had seen the look on his face and knew that he had found something that could change everything. Without saying a word, Lucas handed her the box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw the mirror. The silence between them was suffocating. Neither knew what to say, but both knew that whatever lay ahead was no longer something they could avoid. The land was pulling them deeper into its grasp, and the truth they had uncovered only led to more questions. The mirror was a symbol, an object tied to the land's power. But what was its purpose? Why had it been buried here, waiting for them to find it? The answers were just out of reach, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly distant. But one thing was certain. The land's hunger was far from satisfied, and as the night stretched on, they could both feel it closing in on them. The soil beneath their feet seemed to call out, urging them to look deeper. The harvest was never over. It would never end. The discovery of the mirror had left Lucas and Lily shaken to their core, each of them silently grappling with the weight of what they had unearthed. The farm, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, a place where the past refused to stay buried and where the present could no longer be trusted. The mirror, still sitting on their kitchen table, seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if the land itself was watching them through its fractured surface. Neither of them spoke of what they had seen in the reflection. The image of the figure, its eyes staring back at them with an intensity that felt too real, too close. It was a vision they couldn't shake, a haunting that lingered in the corners of their minds, threatening to overtake them. The days that followed were no less strange. The air around the farmhouse seemed thick with an unseen tension. The wind never seemed to stop howling, its mournful cries filling the night, as if the land was whispering something just beyond their hearing. They had always heard the wind on the farm, but now it felt different, darker, more urgent, as if it carried with it a message meant only for them. And as the days passed, strange things began happening, small but unsettling. Footsteps in the halls when no one was there, flickering lights, objects that were moved from where they had been placed. Each occurrence seemed to grow more deliberate, more calculated, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with them. Lily, ever the pragmatist, tried to dismiss the events as the result of stress, or perhaps the house itself settling. But even she couldn't ignore the mounting sense of dread that weighed on her chest. She found herself staying up at night, eyes darting to the windows, ears straining for the faintest sound. It was as though the very air around them had become charged with an energy they could neither control nor understand. The farm had always been a place of comfort, a place where time seemed to slow down and the world outside faded away. But now, it felt as though the farm was holding them captive, and they were powerless to break free. Lucas, too, felt the oppressive atmosphere that had taken root in the house. He couldn't shake the feeling that the land was alive, that it was aware of their every movement. The more time he spent on the farm, the more he felt the weight of its history pressing down on him. The land had been here long before them, and it seemed to remember every moment of its existence. There was a history to this place, one that went far beyond the family's generations. The farm had always been a peaceful place, a place of memories and tradition. But now it felt like something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them to arrive, to unearth its secrets. Determined to understand what was happening, Lucas began to search through the farmhouse's old records. He scoured through dusty boxes of family heirlooms, looking for any clue that might explain the strange events they were experiencing. It was in one of these boxes that he found a collection of journals, worn, leather-bound books that seemed to have been written by someone long ago. The writing was faded, but the words were still legible. The first journal was dated from the early 1800s, a time when the farm was first established. Lucas could barely contain his excitement as he began to read, hoping that the journals might shed some light on the strange occurrences plaguing them. The entries were disturbing, to say the least. They spoke of rituals, strange ceremonies held in the dead of night, and an unyielding connection to the land. There were mentions of an old spirit that resided on the farm, one that could not be seen but was felt, its presence always hovering in the background. The journals described a pact, one that had been made by the farm's first owners, a pact that tied their souls to the land in exchange for prosperity. The details were vague, but the implication was clear. The land was not merely land. It was alive, and it demanded a price. As Lucas delved deeper into the journals, he discovered that the spirit that haunted the land had not always been a benevolent force. There were accounts of death, of people who had mysteriously disappeared, and of a family who had been driven to madness by the entity that resided on the farm. The more he read, the more it became clear that the spirit was not merely a part of the farm's history. It was its history. It had been feeding off the land, growing stronger with each generation that lived and worked there. And now it was demanding something more. Lily joined him in his search, her curiosity piqued by the strange discoveries. As she read through the journals, she, too, was struck by the similarities between the accounts and their own experiences. The whispers in the wind, the strange visions, the sense of being watched, it was all there, documented by people long gone. But there was something else in the journals, something that both terrified and intrigued them. One entry, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, spoke of a ritual that could break the bond between the spirit and the land, a way to sever the connection and free the farm from its grasp. But the cost of such an act was steep, too steep for anyone to pay. The entry ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted, or worse, silenced. Lucas and Lily exchanged a look, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. The land was bound by a dark history, one that they had unknowingly stepped into, and now they were a part of it. The farm had chosen them, and it was clear that they would never leave without paying the price. But there was still hope. If they could complete the ritual, if they could follow the instructions left behind, they might be able to escape the land's grip. But time was running out, and the land was growing restless. It would not be long before it came for them, as it had come for so many before. That night, as they sat in the dim light of the farmhouse, the wind howling outside, they realized something that would haunt them forever. They were not alone on the farm. The land, the spirit, the history, it was all alive, watching, waiting for the moment when they would either succumb to its power or be the ones to break its hold. The future seemed uncertain, the path ahead obscured by the fog of fear and doubt. But one thing was certain: the farm had claimed them, and it was not willing to let go without a fight. As Lucas and Lily sat in the dim glow of the farmhouse's flickering lamps, the oppressive silence in the house felt heavier than ever. The discovery of the journals had only deepened the mystery of the farm, yet also amplified the fear that now gripped them both. The wind outside had picked up once again, its howling now an incessant roar that seemed to echo through the very walls of the house. The land was restless, and they were increasingly aware that they were running out of time. What they had uncovered about the spirit's ancient pact and the ritual to break its hold on the land felt like the only possible path forward. But the cost of that freedom was one they were not yet prepared to pay. The journal entry about the ritual had left them with more questions than answers. It was clear that the ritual was their only hope, but there was a daunting ambiguity about it. Specific instructions were missing, and the final lines of the entry had been hastily scribbled, almost as if the writer had been trying to escape something. Both Lucas and Lily were struck by the idea that whatever was lurking on this land had a vested interest in keeping them here, entrapping them within its cursed grip. The more they tried to understand it, the more they realized that the spirit's hunger was far from ordinary. It fed on more than just the land. It fed on the very souls of those who called this place home. There was a palpable tension in the air as the two of them debated what to do next. They had to complete the ritual, but how could they perform something so dangerous when they knew so little about it? The journal spoke of a necessary offering, something to appease the spirit, but it offered no details on what that offering was or how it should be made. It only mentioned that the offering had to be one that was given willingly, a sacrifice that came from the heart. Lucas and Lily couldn't help but wonder if this sacrifice was something that would tear them apart. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. What if the offering was them? What if they were meant to give up their connection to each other in exchange for the land's release? The more they thought about it, the more the ritual seemed like a terrible, inevitable choice. But they had no other options. The farm had become a place of horror, a nightmare that they couldn't wake from, and the spirit's power was growing stronger with each passing day. The land was now speaking to them, not in words, but in sensations. Glimmers of shadows in the corner of their eyes, whispers in the wind that seemed to beckon them deeper into the farm's heart. The spirits of the past were closing in on them, their presence becoming undeniable. They could no longer ignore the truth. The farm had been their prison from the very beginning, and now they had to make a choice: stay and suffer, or attempt the ritual and risk everything. They began to prepare themselves for what was to come. They gathered the materials mentioned in the journals: stones, herbs, and a candle that burned with an unnatural flame, as described in the faded entries. The ritual, they realized, required more than just the physical offerings. It demanded emotional and spiritual vulnerability, a deep connection to the farm itself. They had to give up something more than just their physical bodies. They had to offer a piece of their very essence, something that bound them to the land in the same way the spirit had once been bound to it. Lucas knew that they couldn't do this alone. This wasn't just a physical act, it was an emotional one. They would have to trust each other more deeply than they ever had before, not just with their lives, but with their souls. And yet, there was something within him, something primal, that resisted the idea of making such a profound sacrifice. To give up something of himself meant to become something else entirely, something less human, less whole. But there was no other choice. The spirit would never let them go unless they made the offering. As the night grew darker, the farmhouse seemed to close in on them. The walls, once familiar and safe, now felt oppressive, as though they were suffocating under the weight of the land's ancient power. The floorboards creaked with every step they took, and the wind outside howled like a living creature, its voice rising in intensity as though it were urging them to act. Every part of the house seemed to be alive, and every corner of the land seemed to whisper their names. They decided to perform the ritual at midnight, the hour when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. As the clock ticked closer to the chosen hour, Lucas and Lily felt a sense of inevitability settle over them. There was no turning back now. They were committed to the ritual, committed to breaking the curse that bound them to the land. As midnight struck, they stood in the center of the living room, the ritual items arranged carefully around them. The candle flickered in the center, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls, and the wind outside seemed to rise to a crescendo, as if the entire farm was holding its breath. In the silence that followed, they closed their eyes and began to chant the words from the journal. The words were unfamiliar, foreign even, but somehow they felt right. With each syllable, the air around them grew heavier, as though the very earth was responding to the invocation. A cold chill swept through the room, and the flames of the candle grew higher, their eerie glow illuminating the faces of Lucas and Lily in a pale, sickly light. They could feel the presence of the spirit now, watching them, its eyes fixed on their every movement. The ritual was reaching its climax. The offering had to be made, but as the last words of the chant left their lips, something unexpected happened. The room seemed to shift, the walls bending and warping as if the house itself were alive. And then a voice, low and guttural, spoke from the darkness, a voice that sounded as though it were coming from inside their very minds. "You dare disturb me," it whispered. "You think you can break the pact?" The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew thick with an oppressive force that crushed them from all sides. Lucas and Lily stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the land around them seemed to come alive, its ancient power rising in defiance of their intrusion. The offering had been made, but the true cost was yet to be revealed. It was then that they realized this was no ordinary spirit, no mere haunt of the past. This was the farm itself, its soul intertwined with the land, and it would not let go without taking everything. The air inside the farmhouse had shifted from an oppressive stillness to a suffocating weight, and the tremors that rumbled beneath their feet seemed to echo throughout the very foundation of the land. Lucas and Lily stood rooted in place, their bodies trembling as the voice from the darkness seemed to twist around them, filling their minds with dread. The walls of the farmhouse were no longer solid. They felt as if they were breathing in sync with the land. The spirit, no, the farm itself, was awakening, responding to their presence, to their ritual. What had once been a sanctuary for their vacations had now become a cage, its bars invisible, its grip unbreakable. The voice, low and growling, reverberated in their minds like a drumbeat, its words coated in malice. "You think you can break the pact," it hissed again, the tone laced with centuries of rage. "This land is mine, and so are you. The offering has been made, but not as you intended. You have become part of the bargain." The realization hit them like a slap to the face. The ritual had worked, but not in the way they had expected. They had assumed the offering would be something they could control, a sacrifice that would set them free, but now it seemed they were the ones being offered. Bound to the farm, bound to the spirit. The very act of trying to break the curse had sealed their fates. The land had accepted their offering, but in doing so, it had claimed them as its own. The room began to shift once more, the air becoming thick and heavy, as if the very space around them was folding inwards. Shadows crept across the walls, growing long and twisted, forming shapes that seemed to watch them with malice. The wind outside howled like a pack of wolves, but it was not the wind they heard. It was the whispers of the land, the voices of those who had come before them, trapped in a cycle of sacrifice and suffering. Lily stumbled backwards, her hand clutching the old wooden table for support, her face pale with fear. We, we've made a mistake, Lucas, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The land is not just haunted. It's alive. It wants us. It's taken us into its bargain. Lucas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his thoughts were scattered, racing through his mind. How had they misinterpreted the ritual? How had they not seen this coming? They had read the journal, understood the power of the spirit, but they had never truly grasped the full extent of what they were dealing with. The spirit was not an external force they could simply cast out. It was embedded in the very fabric of the land, woven into the soil, the trees, the stones. The pact was not just with a ghost or a demon. It was with the earth itself, a primordial force that had been waiting for them, waiting for the right moment to claim them. The shadows in the room began to take form, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to dance with the flickering light of the candle. The wind outside roared like a living entity, and Lucas could feel the temperature plummet. His breath came out in visible clouds, the cold seeping into his bones. But it wasn't just the temperature. There was something in the air, something tangible and malevolent, that seemed to sink into their very skin, to wrap itself around their hearts and minds. "Why do you fight me?" The voice in the darkness whispered, now closer than ever. "I have given you the choice. You are mine now, just as they were before you. You will never leave. You will become part of this land, part of the spirit, for eternity." The word sent a jolt of terror through Lucas, but he forced himself to focus, to think. They had to act quickly. The ritual had been a mistake, yes, but it wasn't the end. There had to be a way to reverse it, a way to break the bond they had unknowingly formed. The spirit may have claimed them, but they could still fight back. They had come this far, and they could not let fear drive them into submission. "What's happening to us?" Lily asked, her voice breaking as she looked at Lucas, her eyes wide with panic. "I can feel it inside me. Something's changing. It's like I'm being pulled into the land. I can hear the whispers, like they're inside my head." Lucas could feel it too. There was a sensation, a strange and uncomfortable pressure inside his chest, as though something was trying to push its way out of him, out of his very soul. The earth beneath them seemed to be calling, pulling at them like a magnetic force. The spirit was trying to merge with them, to fuse their essence with the land, to make them a part of its eternal cycle. It was no longer a matter of simply breaking the curse. It was a matter of survival. "Stay close," Lucas urged, his voice hoarse. "We need to find a way to break this, to fight back. There has to be something we missed in the journals, something we can use to reverse this." But as he spoke, the shadows in the room seemed to grow, their forms twisting and pulsing with a life of their own. The wind howled louder, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. The spirit had grown impatient, and its influence over them was becoming undeniable. It was as if the land itself was closing in, sealing them in a tomb from which there would be no escape. The land had claimed them, but the question remained. Could they reclaim themselves before it was too late? The hours passed like a blur, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with every moment. Lucas and Lily sat together in the center of the room, desperate, helpless. They could feel the presence of the spirit around them, its tendrils reaching into their minds, pulling at their very essence. But even as the darkness closed in, they refused to give up. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the land's hold and escape the grip of the spirit before it consumed them completely. The wind outside was relentless, its howls now a scream that echoed through the empty fields. The farmhouse, once a symbol of comfort and safety, had become their prison. The land had taken everything from them, their peace, their memories, and now, their very souls. But as the night wore on, they held on to one final hope, the hope that they would find the key to breaking the pact before it was too late. They couldn't let the spirit win. Not yet. Not like this. The days had grown indistinguishable, each one a blur of dread and hopelessness. Lucas and Lily had spent what felt like an eternity inside the farmhouse, locked in an unending battle against the land that had claimed them. The walls of the house no longer felt like walls. They seemed to pulsate with the rhythm of the earth beneath them. The very air they breathed was thick with the presence of the spirit, suffocating them with its constant whispers and promises. The land had them, and it was not going to let them go. They had searched through the journals, through every relic and piece of old folklore they could find, but every attempt to break the curse had been in vain. It was as if the land had anticipated their every move, its grip tightening with each failed attempt. The sacrifices had been made, but it wasn't just the spirit that held them captive. It was the land itself, its power woven into the very soil, the trees, and the winds. What they had thought was a curse had turned into something far more insidious. A pact, an eternal bond that could not be undone. Lily had become increasingly withdrawn, her once vibrant spirit dimming under the weight of their plight. She could feel it inside her, something cold and ancient, like a part of her soul had been claimed by the land. The whispers had become louder, more insistent, and she could no longer tell where her own thoughts ended and where the land's began. The line between them had blurred, and she felt herself slowly fading, being pulled into the earth itself, becoming one with the darkness that had taken root in their lives. Lucas, too, was starting to feel the pull. There was a sensation in his chest, a gnawing emptiness, as if something was being drained from him. His reflections, once sharp and clear, had become clouded by strange dreams and visions. He saw glimpses of other souls, lost and trapped in the same cycle, their faces twisted with terror and longing. He could feel their eyes on him, urging him to do something, anything, to escape the same fate. But what could they do? Every escape attempt had failed. The windows were barred, the doors locked tight, and the earth itself seemed to rise up against them. It was on the 15th night that the final twist came. The farmhouse, as if responding to their desperation, began to shift again. The foundation of the house groaned, the walls bending as though the house itself were alive, a massive, living organism that breathed and pulsed in time with the land. The shadows inside the house deepened, becoming thick and oppressive, their forms stretching unnaturally as though reaching out to them. The wind outside howled louder, louder than ever before, and Lucas and Lily both felt it, an overwhelming, all-encompassing pressure that seemed to come from every direction. It was no longer just the spirit. It was the farm, the land. It was alive, and it was waking up. The voice, the same deep, guttural tone that had tormented them for weeks, echoed in the air. "You are mine now," it whispered. "I gave you a choice, but you refused. Now, you must pay the price." The words were like a slap in the face, a cold reminder of their helplessness. They had tried to fight back, tried to break free, but they had only dug themselves deeper into the land's grasp. The spirit had been patient, allowing them to believe they had some control over their fate. But now, the time had come for the final reckoning. The bargain had been struck long ago, and there was no undoing it. Lucas felt his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. "No," he said, though his voice trembled with doubt. "We can still fight. We can still break free." The voice laughed, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. "You are nothing but vessels. Vessels for the land's will. You can resist all you want, but you will be drawn back. You will be reborn into the earth, as they were before you. The cycle is eternal." Lily, her face pale and ghostly, looked at Lucas with wide eyes. What if we can't escape? What if this is our fate?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What if there's no way out?" The question hung in the air like a thick fog. What if there was no escape? What if they were doomed to remain trapped in this cycle forever, their souls bound to the land, their lives reduced to mere shadows of their former selves? The thought was almost too much to bear. But there was one thing they had learned in their time in the farmhouse. Nothing was truly set in stone. If the land had a claim on them, it was not because of fate, but because of choice. They had made a choice when they first arrived, when they decided to confront the spirit, when they invoked the pact. But the land's power was not absolute. It was bound by the choices they made now. They had always believed they were at the mercy of the land, that they were trapped by forces beyond their control. But they had missed something crucial. The land, the spirit, the farmhouse, they all responded to their choices. The power of the pact was not an unbreakable chain, but a force that could be altered. Perhaps not completely erased, but bent. They could still fight back. Lucas turned to Lily, his face hardening with resolve. "We have to make a choice, Lily. We have to choose to fight, to break the cycle. The land's power is strong, but it is not invincible. We have one last chance to make this right." Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some trace of the hope that had once lived there. It was there, buried beneath the fear, beneath the terror that had taken root in them both. The choice they had to make was simple, but it was not easy. They had to confront the land, confront the spirit, and in doing so, confront themselves. They had to reclaim their agency, even if it meant facing the unknown, even if it meant sacrificing everything to sever the bond. The wind outside reached a fever pitch, and the farmhouse groaned under the pressure. But Lucas and Lily stood firm. They would make their final stand. They would not let the land claim them forever. The final choice had been made. They would fight, and in the end, they would either break the cycle or be consumed by it forever. The air in the farmhouse was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and a bitter, metallic taste that clung to their tongues. Lucas and Lily stood together in the center of the room, eyes locked in determination. The weight of the land's presence pressed down on them, its pulse a rhythmic thrum in the walls and the ground beneath their feet. For weeks, they had been prisoners of this place, the farmhouse their cage, the land their warden. But now, in the silence that surrounded them, there was a feeling they had not experienced before. The feeling of choice, the feeling of agency. They had reached the point of no return. The spirit, the land, and the farmhouse had all bent to the will of their choices. But the cost of their defiance was clear. The land had given them one last chance, one final moment of clarity, a choice that would break the cycle or leave them bound forever. The realization was as terrifying as it was liberating. They could no longer pretend that they were mere victims of a curse. The land's power was not inescapable. It was a force that fed on their fear, on their hesitation, on their unwillingness to face the truth about their own roles in this twisted narrative. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the wind outside howled like a chorus of lost souls. She could feel the land shifting, the earth beneath her feet rumbling with an energy that seemed to come from deep within. The whispers had intensified, growing louder with each passing moment. But now, as she stood there, with Lucas at her side, she felt something else, a strange clarity. The land, the spirit, the farmhouse, they all depended on their belief in the impossibility of escape. The cycle thrived on their surrender to fate, to the notion that there was no way out. But that was a lie. It always had been. Lucas's voice broke the stillness, low and steady. "We're not going to run anymore, Lily. We're not going to beg or search for a way out. We're going to face it. Face the land, face the spirit. This is the only way to end this." Lily nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and frantic, but it steadied as she focused on Lucas's words. They had spent so long searching for a way out, searching for a solution that would come from the outside. But the truth was that the answer had always been inside them, in their own willingness to accept the truth about the land's power. They had always thought the land held them captive because of its strength, its dark magic. But it was their fear that had given it life. It was their unwillingness to believe they could fight back that had allowed it to thrive. The land had claimed them because they had allowed it, but now they were ready to take that power back. The farmhouse groaned again, a deep, low sound that seemed to echo from the foundations. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to stir, as though something vast and ancient was waking up. The spirit's voice echoed through the room, colder and more menacing than before. "You cannot escape. You cannot break the pact." Lucas's grip tightened on Lily's hand. The voice in the room was no longer just the spirit. It was the land, speaking with one unified voice, its presence a suffocating weight. But Lucas had no more doubt. They were not powerless. They had already broken the cycle once, and they would do it again. "We made a choice," Lucas said, his voice strong and unwavering. "You cannot force us into your cycle. We choose to be free. We choose to end this. Lily closed her eyes for a moment, summoning all the strength she could muster. She had heard the voice of the land, felt its pull, and understood its power. But what the land did not understand was that their choices were not just reactions to its will. They were declarations. They were the ones who had given the land power by believing in its grip, by accepting that escape was impossible. But now they were choosing to believe in something different. They were choosing to believe in themselves, in their ability to change the course of their fate. As she spoke the words, her voice barely a whisper, the air in the room shifted. "We are not yours," she said. "We are not part of your cycle. We break the pact." The ground trembled beneath them, as though the earth itself were screaming in protest. But they stood firm, their hands joined together, and with every word they spoke, they felt the land's grip loosen. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to shake, the shadows in the corners of the room retreating. The oppressive weight in the air lightened, as though a storm cloud was being pushed away by an unseen force. The wind outside began to die down, and with it, the whispers faded into silence. The spirit's voice, once so loud and insistent, was no longer heard. The farmhouse stopped groaning, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was still. The land had been silent. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, in the distance, a sound broke the stillness. The faint chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the trees. The familiar sounds of a world untouched by the horrors that had once ruled their lives. The land, the farmhouse, the spirit, they had retreated as if recognizing the strength of their resolve. The cycle had ended. They were free, but the freedom came with a cost. The farmhouse, once their prison, now felt hollow. The weight of their experience lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had almost consumed them. The land had claimed so many before them, and it would continue to claim others. But for now, Lucas and Lily were free. Their journey had ended, but the question of what would come next remained. What did it mean to be free after such an ordeal? How did one move on from something so deeply ingrained in the soul? They stepped outside, the cool night air welcoming them. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the land that had once held them captive. For the first time, they looked at it not as prisoners, but as survivors. They had broken the cycle, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their lives.